Hi, it's Stacy Griesbach, and welcome to Stacy Sings Ella. Today we're launching a new part of the series called Talking Ella, where I will be taking you inside a little bit more of Ella Fitzgerald's career through different experts, musicians, and people that worked with Ella throughout her time. I'm so delighted because my first guest today is Justin Binek, and Justin is studying for his doctoral degree at the University of North Texas. Welcome, Justin.
Good to be here, Stacey. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, well, first of all, tell us a little bit about yourself, and I'd love to hear more about your background in jazz.
Sure. So as you said, I am currently studying for my doctoral degree in jazz performance here at the University of North Texas. Also doing a related field in choral conducting while I'm at it. And then I'm also a teaching fellow here, so I teach applied jazz lessons, direct one of the vocal jazz groups here, teach advanced vocal improv, teach freshman vocal jazz fundamentals, and then do a fairly healthy amount of playing and outside freelance work as well too.
That's wonderful. Well, listen, I'm so happy you're here, but most importantly to talk about Ella, which seems to be
Sure.
both. We share this in common, a mutual sort of focus right now in our lives. So tell us a little bit. As I understand, you have a specific project that you're researching for as part of your doctoral studies down in Texas that focuses on the one and only lovely Miss Ella Fitzgerald, perfectly timed to her centennial. Tell us a little bit about that.
Searching, but done. Here's the beast. So what I did for my final dissertation document was I did a critical analysis of 10 years worth of Ella Fitzgerald solos during kind of a really formative time in her career, 1943 to 1952, when she was exclusively recording for Decca Records. And I wanted to focus on a developmental period in her career rather than looking at sort of for lack of a better way of putting it, the mature, developed Ella. I wanted to take a look at some of the ways in which her solo approach was developing, and specifically to really look at what was going on in terms of her syllabic content. Because as a teacher of jazz singing, the number one thing that I encounter with beginning jazz singers is them saying, I don't know what syllables I should use. And so I have certain tools that I've used at different points, but given that Ella is kind of the gold standard as far as the way that most people tend to regard scat singing, I wanted to take a look at her and especially look at her developmental process to see kind of to try and find a few things. Number one, to figure out if there was a true sort of language of Ella's improv that could actually be codified, and then also to look at how it evolved and changed. And so that's kind of how I ended up focusing on this 10-year period in particular.
Wow, incredible. And I guess focusing on that part of her career when she was with Decca, this is while she was with the Chick Webb Orchestra or right after, or both?
I mean, both, but in particular, this time period is right at the beginning of this 10-year period is right at the very end of when she was with the Chick Webb Orchestra, and then moving beyond that more into her solo career, and then also kind of doing whatever Decca wanted her to do, whether it was singing background fills on Ink Spots recordings or whatever. So
right. Well, I'd like to talk a little bit about scatting, since that is your focal point for your dissertation. For many singers, I think scatting seems to be very difficult and can be very difficult. What is it that goes into a good scat singer or a good scat solo, and what in your mind, what is it that makes it so challenging?
Well, a good scat solo, it's a juggling act. One of the improv teachers here, Mike Seinell, he actually has a great philosophy about jazz improv in general that I really kind of like, in that he likes to say that for an educated audience member listening to a solo, 50% of the time, they should have a pretty good idea of where you're going next. And then 50% of the time, they should have no idea where you're going next. So it's the idea of simultaneously creating and building musical ideas that an audience member can latch onto and appreciate and be like, oh, okay, I hear where that's going, but then also managing to maintain the interest and to be able to kind of throw in the curveball every now and then of, oh, wow, I wasn't expecting that. Um, for a vocalist, then there is the syllabic picture that gets tied in on top of it, and the idea of, okay, well, how exactly do I make this sound cool and not sound lame? Which is one thing that a lot of singers worry about, including if I have this conversation on a regular basis with my own students. And actually, I mean, the cool thing that, as I've done a lot of research into not just Ella, but transcribing a whole lot of singers, really the best singers kind of tended to, in terms of syllabic content, really kind of narrow things down. I mean, they using a wide variety of things, but in large part, kind of focusing on what they did on a couple, like 6 or 7 particular solo groups or articulative ideas. Just, I think, in part, so that it's like by by simplifying that, then then it's easier to actually devote mental energy to focusing on the musical side of it.
I guess looking then at Ella's scat solos throughout her career, do you think she had a process or sort of a way that she developed her scat solos?
Absolutely. And in particular, in looking at this particular 10-year period, it was really pretty fascinating because I kind of found, I sort of ended up, I mean, my focus was predominantly on syllabic choice, but I kind of ended up identifying essentially 4 different sort of syllabic sets that either were associated with a certain period of time or specific types of rep. Before 1946, predominantly at that point, when she would sing a scat solo, it would be on a swing tune. And generally speaking, during that time period, like about half of her syllabic content was built around syllable, either these exact syllables or like variants of these: dul, boo, di, oo, do, ba, and e. So when you combine those and just sort of start, like, even just taking those 7 and playing with them, you get this that kind of approach. 1946, Ella toured with the Dizzy Gillespie Orchestra, and this to me ended up being one of the biggest, and to me, I think actually the most important thing that I found in the course of doing this. Her syllabic vocabulary changed perceptibly during this time period. And I think it's because of the influence of Dizzy and his orchestra. Part of it being just dealing with bebop tempos, but then also looking at like in both instrumental and vocal articulation for improvisation. Dizzy and his bandmates, particularly John Brown and Ken Hawgood, would play around, would scat. I mean, they on tunes like Oop-a-ba-da and Uliaku and Jump Diddly Ba. They would trade back and forth with each other, and you can hear some of those syllabic ideas showing up in the recordings that Ella made in 1947, like "Oh Lady Be Good" and "How High the Moon." At that point, and again, part of this is just bebop tempo, period, but there's much more of an increase of syllables with a D onset consonant because it's more built around articulation of the tongue, and it moves faster than doing the exploded B consonant. And so at that point, there's a shift more towards dul, di, oo, do, bi, ah, and di, so that at that tempo you've got more of this just to pull all of that much more on the teeth, essentially.
Fascinating. I'd have you do another 16 or 32 bars of that.
Well, and then and like I said, I kind of found four specific patterns. So it's like I have the pre-dizzy Ella, I have the immediate post-dizzy Ella. Then as I started looking at other kind of double time ideas after 1946, like the middle section of Rough Ridin', where she does 10 bars of blistering double time work, or the entirety of something like Airmail Special. There, it's kind of, again, it's the idea of creating a syllabic framework that is really kind of centered around even more on this heavy D onset consonant and the use of dul and din as connectives, so that, again, the faster the tempo, the more that those sorts of syllabic ideas fall into place. The and just kind of, again, it's all about kind of minimizing the space here and just focusing on the idea of the articulation of the tongue. And then, like, at the end of this time period, I really spent some time looking at the vocalized instrumentals of 1951 and 1952, Smooth Sailin', Airmail Special, Rough Ridin', and Preview. And to me, this represents the formation of kind of, again, putting an academic hat on, what I'll call common practice Ella, which is, at this point, there's a little bit more B consonant that gets added back into the mix because it's more of a mixture of tempos. Also, at this point, she starts adding more of a Y onset that kind of adds a little bit of a more of a glide and more of a, what I'll call a zhuzh to the solo. And that's where, you know, when you look at the most common syllable groups that you use in these, like do, bu, din, di, u, y, that's where you kind of get really what we think of when we think of pretty much any Ella Fitzgerald solo from the 50s, 60s, or 70s. That so for me to kind of be able to compare and contrast those back and forth, those with each other, that to me is probably, well, no, well, I was about to say, that's kind of the single biggest thing, but it's actually four conclusions, so it's not really the single biggest thing, but you know what I'm saying.
Oh, fascinating. I mean, really, the level of depth. So how long did you work on this research project?
Well, on and off for the better part of 3 years.
Wow.
Well, kind of it all started, when I made the decision to kind of go back and get and to get the doctoral degree, I wasn't exactly sure what direction I was going to go with this. I mean, actually going back into school, I figured that I would probably end up writing something about the intersection of French Impressionism and early jazz as far as a doctoral thesis. But kind of in an early class, I ended up doing sort of an initial bit of study on a couple of these solos, and kind of digging in a fairly big way. And the more that I got into it, the more that I started to think that, wow, okay, this could actually be a thing. And then actually for me, this sort of, I said I've been working on this for 3 years, but actually for me, this goes back about 10 years. Back in 2006, 2007, Diana Spradling, retired professor of vocal jazz at Western Michigan University, asked me if I would write the section on improvisation for her book, Jazz Singing, Developing Artistry and Authenticity. And what she really wanted that chapter to be was to focus on transcription and analysis of great solos. And she kind of gave me carte blanche to go wherever I wanted to with it. She was just like, I'd like solos from about 6 different people, and make sure that Sarah Vaughan's Julia Bop and Mel Torme's Route 66 from Live at the Maisonette are in there somewhere. And beyond that, transcribe whatever you want, and whatever conclusions you reach, great. And so out of that, I ended up doing not just Sarah and Mel, but also obviously Ella. Her, I picked a 1959 live Jazz Philharmonic version of Lady Be Good. I also picked some Betty Carter, some Mark Murphy, some Bobby McFerrin. And again, kind of it was an early stage of this sort of syllabic analysis and looking at the harmonic ideas behind it in less detail than I went to here. But even there, I kind of created this this conclusion for that section that I refer to as the 10 habits of highly effective scat singers, and so there was a syllabic component to that. And so the more that I've gotten into this, and the more that, like I said, the more that I have students who are just like, I don't know what syllables I should use, the more that I've been really kind of digging into the idea of research on syllabic choice, in part because, just as the John Murphy, who is the head of the Jazz Studies division here at UNT, he and I, when we first started talking about it, he made the comment that, just as for a saxophonist, the mouthpiece, the reed, and the ligature help to shape tone and timbre for the saxophonist, syllabic choice is kind of how a singer shapes tone and timbre as an improviser, which I thought was a great analogy to kind of tie in the vocal and instrumental concepts together.
No, that's fascinating, and you'll have to send me a link for the book, and I can put it in the bottom in the notes of my YouTube post. Now, I want to, I guess we're in the weeds. I'd like to bring us back a little bit because, and I love the weeds. But, in terms of Ella and her scat singing, and when you look at, like you were saying, the different singers of that time, and if we look at, say, the 50s, which is probably on the early or the later end of your research, my question is, what do you think, there were so many wonderful girl singers, if you will, at that time. You had June Christie and Edie Gourmet and Julie London. What was it about scat singing in Ella that made it such a powerful, such a powerful figure in musical history that, we're celebrating her in such regard 100 years later?
Well, I think I'm speaking totally off the cuff here, and I have absolutely nothing to back this up in any way, shape, or form whatsoever. But I don't know. I've talked to students about this before, and I guess a way that I like to think about it, and kind of as I've read, as I've done my own research, as I've gone through different things, obviously Louis Armstrong was the first great scat singer. But Louis kind of marks a dead end. Like, you have Louis doing amazing things in the late 1920s, and there's not really necessarily a logical follow-up to him as far as, and here were these host of imitators who built on what he did. I think the argument that I would make is I feel like Ella Fitzgerald made scat singing more accessible in terms of her approach and in terms of the way that she went about it. In large part because, we were talking about the predictability of lines and ideas earlier, because so much of Ella's approach was built on the idea of the riff, find something good, do it again, do it again, do it again up a third, do it again up a third from that, and stretch it out for the better part of 16 bars. It's something that gave the average listener something to grasp onto. And, of course, was totally in line with the big band tradition that she had been brought up in since she started singing with the Chick Webb Band. So I think in a lot of ways, between the sequential nature of so much of what she did, and then also her creative use of quotes and humorous touches that she would put in there, to me there's always been a certain accessibility to Fitzgerald's scat singing that even some of the most diehard classical singers that I know, who, as a general rule, tend to take I don't really understand most of what's going on, tend to dig Ella. Like, it's a thing. Partly because it's an amazing instrument, and like you can't deny just the flexibility of the tone there. But also, again, I think it boils down to the idea of the accessibility of the material that she created as an improviser.
Right. You were mentioning how she would throw in quotes, and one of the songs that we have in our set is "I Can't Give You Anything But Love," and for part of it, she imitates Louis Armstrong. Then she brings
Mhm.
in like Elvis Presley, blue suede shoes. She to me she was maybe a little bit of a comedian on stage.
Oh, totally.
Yeah.
And they and there's so much in some of these solos that I've been encountering. And it's one of those things where I think one thing that is important to note is that there's obviously a huge amount of planning that went into the way that she decided to utilize quotes within her solos. They in the 1947 Lady Be Good, the classic one, uh, her use of different quote material is absolutely and completely seamless, whether it's the end of the bridge in chorus 4 where it's just suddenly this or the Star Eyes quote in the third chorus where it's just kind of like seamlessly snuck in just this and then off into another sequential idea. Her integration of that sort of material really was well thought out, and it's it's beautifully planned. Again, things that I like to tell my students: have a plan. Please go into a solo with a plan. It can simply be just like, I'm going to start simple and I'm going to gradually ramp up the intensity and the complexity. Cool, that's a plan. But it's a simple plan, but it's a plan nonetheless.
Right, right. Good advice. Well, getting back to scatting as a differentiator for Ella, I guess my question is, given all these beautiful singers throughout the 40s and 50s, where do you think it was that Ella realized that, hey, scatting is my thing, and I'm going to really kind of own this in terms of this is where I make my mark? Do you think she ever thought that, and do you think that was, like I said, a differentiator?
I don't know that she ever really thought that per se. Um, I think, okay, I mentioned the fact that in looking at the evolution of vocal improv, Louis Armstrong is something of a little bit of a dead end, but that isn't completely accurate because in some ways, Ella really was the natural heir to Louis Armstrong in terms of just kind of the idea of both harmonic material and just, kind of taking those ideas, the Louis' vocal improvisational ideas and moving forward with that. I doubt that Ella ever saw herself as an improviser on the same level as Sarah Vaughan did, although Will Friedwald claims that Ella herself actually stated that she was the greatest scat singer who ever lived, so that might not be completely accurate. But I think with Ella, it was the idea of it was part of a well-rounded package, but not necessarily the here's something that I am just going to necessarily devote myself to being awesome at. Sarah Vaughan, it is clear that Sarah really dedicated herself to the craft of improvisation from a deep theoretical and harmonic perspective. Ella, probably not so much, and that's okay. To me, I always like to compare Ella Fitzgerald and Sarah Vaughan because they're kind of two sides of the same coin. Sarah was absolutely a more theoretically minded improviser. Sarah was also a pretty fantastic pianist too, so there is that as well. In comparing the two of them back and forth, I'm not even going to say that I like one more than the other because they're different. Sarah's improvisational approach is just kind of by definition of who she was as a musician and the way she approached it. It's a more cerebral approach to improv. And I feel like Ella's Ella's was a little bit more of a populist approach to improvisation.
Well, I know she sure seemed like she beamed joy no matter what she did, and that was something
Sure.
that's definitely a quality that attracted me. And I just recently rewatched an interview she did in the 70s with a Canadian broadcaster, and she re-emphasized, I think in a few interviews, she talked about how much she really loved to sing ballads.
Yeah,
And however much we talk about scat singing and Ella, there are just those beautiful, tender ballads. In my project, I had already picked the 100 tunes, and I had already had all the transcriptions done, and then I came across Imagination, and it
yeah.
was a song that I had just kind of flipped over, and I heard it. I was playing one of my albums in the car, and I went, "What? No, 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 no! This has to be in it." And it's turned out to be probably one of my favorite ballads of hers.
Well, I mean, despite the fact that I wrote an entire dissertation about Ella Fitzgerald and scat singing, my favorite Ella Fitzgerald album, just bar none, without a doubt, Ella Fitzgerald sings the George and Ira Gershwin songbook, which has no scat solos on it whatsoever on any of the 3 CDs, or I guess the 4 LPs that it was originally. But it, yeah, it's a beautiful album, and to me, what's cool is that it speaks to the well-roundedness of Ella as a musician and just as an interpreter of the American songbook.
Well, listen, I would love to sit. I think you and I could probably talk about Ella Fitzgerald recordings for hours. I want
Yes,
to
we.
thank you so much for sharing a little bit about your dissertation. Now, if folks are really interested and they want to learn more, where can they go?
Okay, couple of different things. So I recently gave a lecture recital on the dissertation, detailing both my research and then also uh, performing tunes, essentially kind of taking some of the principles that I had uncovered in the research and then applying them to other tunes that Ella didn't actually record. Uh, so like I said, I did that as a lecture recital. Uh, it's it's available on Facebook. I live streamed it through Facebook Live, and even if people aren't Facebook friends with me, if they just search for Justin Binek on Facebook, I made it a public video, so it is absolutely open for anyone to view.
Wonderful. Well, and I know you have a few, learning opportunities, so we'll put all that in the comments below. Justin,
Yeah,
thank you so much for being my first guest here on Talking Ella, and
it was a.
keep
You say,
educating those beautiful students.
I certainly will.
All right, see you soon.